a lot of them because I worked over a very large number of case studies for roughly 10 years. And this tradition, this healing tradition, was centered on the Dalits, the so-called untouchables of India. And I lived with them. I spoke their language. I'd never used a translator, so I had very close contact with them for about 10 years. What were they being healed of, these low-caste people? Well, the title of the book suggests it. The book that I published on this is called God of Justice, Ritual Healing and Social Justice in the Western Himalayas. So I try to make the connection between the oppression of this particular group of people and the kinds of suffering that they endure and the kinds of healing techniques that are used for that. And the very title points to the interplay of issues of social justice with health. The book, of course, has a complex story, and I don't have time to go into all the details. The rituals themselves are very dramatic. There's lots of possession and trance and animal sacrifice and so forth. And because of the very intense nature of the rituals and these people's social position, I myself had some religious and existential and ethical crises, and if you want to read about them, you have to buy the book. If you were anthropologists, I'd give you lots of ethnographic detail to back up my argument. But with all of the possession and animal sacrifice and trance and so forth, this very easily becomes an example of what Rachel just warned us against, that is exoticizing the other. And I don't have time for it anyway, so I will avoid. Instead, I want to go on to talk about how this all relates to the global health movement. So here is a very condensed version of my argument in the book. The argument is that tension and strife in the social environment often lead to physical and psychological affliction. These tensions are especially salient within the family. Quarrels over land, jealousy at others' success, abuse and exploitation of young brides, conflict between the generations, pressure on people to do well in school, demands from newly wedded couples to have children. These are typical sources of great psychological stress. And my book describes in great ethnographic detail a ritual system in which these conflicts are identified, named, objectified, and exorcised, very often in the form of ghosts and demons. Most importantly, the parties to the dispute, those who are engaged in these forms of conflict, are pushed and pulled and cajoled and threatened until they join hands, as it were, metaphorically, well, literally actually, and perform a common ritual. They forgive each other in a public and formal and ritualized way. They have a common meal, and this might be people who have not eaten together for years because of their conflicts, perhaps not even in generations. Now, we've talked a lot. I'm so glad you came in, Vikram. We've talked a lot about the social determinants of mental health. You will find this phrase in the foundational documents of the global health movements. Well, my book is all about the social determinants of mental health and illness. It is about social causes of mental distress and behavioral disorders. And it talks a lot about the social and cultural location of their cure. Before I continue, I want to make my own position clear. What I'm trying to do in this paper is to promote pluralism in mental health. I think it's good that these systems exist, and I would be very sad to see them disappear. And I also value controversy and critique. I think that's what academic life is all about. So I'm trying to be controversial so that we can stimulate a discussion. And I hope you take it in the positive sense in which it is intended. I share Derek Summerfield's concern that global mental health is or might become a form of neo-imperialism. I fear that global health movement might lead to doing away with these traditional forms of healing. I fear that global health might well lead simply to more psychiatry, more psychopharmaceuticals, and more mental institutions. Now, my colleagues in this area, my old friend Vikram Patel and my new friend Joop de Jong, say to me, no, Bo, you've got it all wrong. We are deeply interested in ritual traditional healing. We are respectful of it. There is no conflict between the universal claims of Western psychiatry on the one hand and the particular local healing traditions on the other. This is not about more psychiatrists. It is not about mental institutions. Oh no. It is about decentralization. It is about local control. It is about empowering local people. But I think that this claim is belied, at least partly belied, by the rhetoric of the global mental health movement, and I want to take you back to Vikram's lecture this morning to show how. Now, Vikram is, of course, right. Every culture has a concept more or less equivalent to mental illness, or at least, behavioral disorder. and more or less everyone recognizes something like mental illness. And similarly, everyone has a cure, a method for dealing with it. And these methods often involve religion and ritual. They involve ritualized ways of putting people back in touch with their families, their ancestors, their natural environments, and so forth. These kinds of what I will call mental health therapy, I mean, we could argue about the term, but let me just call it that. These kinds of traditional mental health therapy are universal. Everyone has them. They're not just in India and Africa. They are here in Montreal, and they're in Paris, and they're in Heidelberg. It's not a case of exotic Asian people. It's something that everybody's got. And yet, advocates of global mental health often talk of a treatment gap. This morning, Vikram cited a figure of 90%. There is no treatment gap. Certainly, there are many places where Western psychiatry does not exist, but there's no treatment gap. It's only you call it a gap if these traditional methods don't count as treatment. Psychology counts, psychiatry counts, pharmaceuticals count, but traditional healing evidently does not. Otherwise, you wouldn't call it a gap. And what are the figures quoted to back up this claim that there is a treatment gap? The number of psychiatrists per unit of population, the availability of drugs. This is what is used to prove the fact that there is a gap. But indigenous medicines are there. Indigenous healers are there. I think it was Joop quoted the verhältnis, the relationship of healers in most traditional societies. There's a lot of them, a lot more than psychiatrists or psychologists. Or again, Vikram, you're my old friend. I don't want you to, this is positively meant. You're the advocate, so I'm picking on your speech. Vikram talked about people's health in people's hands. Well, this is people's health in people's hands. And these methods are often quite effective, at least as effective as Western psychotherapy, as one of the people showed. Now, of course, there are abuses, there is quackery, there is exploitation of clients, there are ineffective treatments. Oh, you thought I was speaking about psychiatry, didn't you? No, actually, I'm speaking about traditional healing. There are abuses there, too, as well as in psychiatry. But just as we do not condemn the discipline of psychiatry because of some abuses, similarly, we shouldn't condemn all of traditional healing because we can find the occasional abuses, including my favorite case that I mentioned yesterday, the traditional healer whose method consists of hitting his clients over the head with wooden chairs. Now, let me make my position clear. I am in favor of pluralism in mental health. I do want psychiatry and psychopharma to be more widely available. This is a good idea. Many people would benefit from this. I can repeat it if you want, but you have no argument from you there. I think it would be good if modern scientific mental health interventions were more widely available, no doubt about it. I've said it twice. But the rhetoric of global mental health clearly ignores ritual healing, traditional healing, what we might call indigenous mental health therapy. It ignores these forms of treatment, these perfect examples of people's health in people's hands, as if they did not exist. And by doing so, it shows that indeed the movement is largely about importing Western psychiatry and psychology into those countries that don't have it. It is about replacing local systems with Western ones. Now, it is perfectly legitimate to make this argument. It is perfectly legitimate to say that you want to replace or augment traditional mental health therapies with psychiatric ones. I think that if you use the word replace, the position is wrong. And I also think it's impractical, because you'll never replace traditional healing with modern healing. They serve different needs. They have different clientele. They're not addressing exactly the same problems. And that is why no matter how modern and scientific and high-tech your mental or other forms of health delivery are, these kinds of alternative medicines will persist. In fact, they're growing in North America and Europe as far as we know. Anyway, my point is that this is a legitimate position. If you want to replace it, fine. In fact, I would think it's the dominant position, the most powerful position in the field of global health, including global mental health. But you should say what you mean and not cloak the position under the rhetoric of pluralism. And if we're serious about pluralism, then we have to think seriously about how to promote it. Let me develop these thoughts a bit further. I've given you my own theory, in a nutshell, of how ritual healing works in my field area, in the tradition that I studied. Can this model be generalized? No. In fact, all of these systems of healing that we call traditional healing have very little in common. They are extremely diverse. In the tradition that I studied, diagnosis through oracular possession is common, while others make use of different techniques: dreams, prayer, the reading of bones, psychological persuasion, aesthetics, narrative, the placebo effect, memories, social support networks, herbal medicines, surgery. Got lots of citations in that list, right? You can make a long, long list of the techniques that are used. Empirically, the various techniques that we label ritual healing are exceedingly various and will be lost if we try to develop a definition of traditional healing based on particular traits. In fact, it is difficult to define ritual healing at all because it is nothing more than a leftover category. It is a set of practices defined in terms of what they are not. They are not medical, they are not scientific, they are not mainstream, they are not recognized. Biomedicine is supported by, including psychiatry, is supported by a worldwide network of medical schools, government health systems, peer-reviewed journals, conferences like this one, pharmaceutical industry, the list goes on and on. It's extremely powerful. And that's the first thing that I tell my students, or tell myself if I'm doing research. The first thing you have to take note of if you're working on traditional healing is it's in a weak position. This is an asymmetrical relation. This is David and Goliath, and these systems have less political power, less financial power, less epistemological power, less social status. They're very weak relative to this universal biomedical. We were warned about calling it a system. That's true enough. It's not necessarily one thing, but it hangs together pretty well, and it's represented in the government health industries, and you sort of know what I mean. So what do they have in common? Nothing. They are the traditions of small people, weak people, poor people. As opposed to the health-related disciplines of medicine, psychiatry, and so on, these are what I like to call the undisciplines. And the whole force of my paper is to argue that they are of value, that they represent sources of valuable knowledge, that it would be a great misfortune if they were lost, that if we do lose them, this will have a negative effect on the mental health of the people whom they serve. In the paper, I make the following points about traditional healing generally. How much time do I have left? First of all, these systems tend to integrate sufferers in terms of local cosmology, language. 5 minutes?
5.
Only 5, oh dear. 10, okay, that was easy. General points about traditional healing. First of all, they integrate sufferers in terms of local cosmology, language, religion, and so forth. So you're being integrated into entire cosmology. It's not just your brain or your mind or your psyche that's being worked on, but your kin relationships and your relationships in the community, to your ancestors, and so on and so forth. We all know this. Secondly, what I think is a very important point, in many areas the object of therapy is not an individual, it is a larger unit, typically a family. This is true of Indian medicine generally. When people go to the hospital, they don't go alone, they go with their families. When a patient is in a hospital, he or she is rarely left alone. To be left alone in a hospital is a kind of nightmare. I can use that for India, it's all right. So the unit of therapy is a family unit. It's not an individual. I think this is very important. And thirdly, there is quite a bit of evidence suggesting that they are often efficacious. Now, this is a contentious point. There are a lot of studies that support this position. Fernando listed some of them today. I have a few others. But the fact is, we do not have what biomedical people would regard as good evidence for the efficaciousness of these systems. Why not? Well, you might say, because they don't work. But in fact, the studies haven't been done. It's really difficult to say one way or another with scientific certainty. Why haven't the studies been done? It's the asymmetry. Who cares? I mean, I care, we care in this room, but we're a tiny little minority. And again, it's the David and Goliath problem. Pharmaceutical companies don't much care. They're not going to fund these studies. The dominant system is uninterested. It assumes that they are ineffective. Funding isn't available. A gold standard experiment of clinical trials is going to be difficult or impossible to conduct in the field, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting thing to discuss, but I want to move on to the core of the paper. What I did in the paper was to ask the question, all right, grant me for the moment, even if you're skeptical, if you grant me the idea that these systems might sometimes be effective, then should we integrate ritual healers into the health system? Should we try to make use of them? I've already talked about structural blindness. I've already talked about the fact that these people are invisible to the health authorities. They do not appear in the statistics. They are ignored in the founding documents that we've heard today. So there's a kind of structural blindness. They are not seen. They are invisible to the health authorities. There's lots of examples of this, but I need to race ahead. Even though they're everywhere, the authorities don't see them. But if ritual healing sometimes works, and if this has to do with the fact that it is holistic, that it addresses the whole person, then why not incorporate it into the health system? Should we not employ ritual healers to work with medical professionals, like psychiatrists? Shouldn't we have them treat the disorders for which their techniques are appropriate? Should we not recruit them to help disseminate important public health information, train them to refer patients with particular problems to the appropriate biomedical practitioners? The answer in my paper is no, we shouldn't. Why not? Don't misunderstand me. I think it would be a great thing if it was possible. But given the way that public health works, given the way that medical systems work, I think it would backfire. And I think it would be counterproductive for 4 reasons. First of all, the individualism of psychiatry is incompatible with these family-centered notions of personhood. Again, this is a long discussion. Notions of personhood vary from culture to culture. Lawrence gave his grid, his very useful grid about different kinds of personhood found around the world. If medical anthropology teaches us anything, it is this idea that notion of the person varies. The psychiatry is focused on the individual. Of course, there are exceptions to this. You can talk about systemic therapy and sorts of things, but the mainstream is focused on individual development, on individual clients, on individual psyches. And if you introduce this kind of model of the person in India, not only is it less likely to work, it might be toxic. And there's some evidence that it is. Secondly, second reason is the social distance between public health workers and ritual healers. Typical ritual healer is illiterate, uneducated, barefoot, probably rather poor, low caste, a tribal person. And one of us might really be interested in this, in him or in her, and want to talk to them and make friends with them and find out what they know. But you have to think about a sort of typical public health worker in the village, somebody who's been co-opted into the system. He's not going to respect that traditional healer. He's going to regard him as ignorant, superstitious, backward, uneducated, low class, low caste, tribal, all of these pejorative terms, and that's the way that those people, I think, are going to be treated in the most variety of cases. You're not going to get the mutual respect that this co-optation would require. Third reason, ritual therapies cannot be incorporated into any modern health system. Ritual, the concept of ritual has an unusual relationship to the modern scientific episteme. Foucault defined this episteme as the conditions of possibility for what counts as scientific. In my view, ritual is precisely the negation of this episteme. It's exactly, ritual is defined as something that inherently is unscientific, which is one of the things that makes it such an interesting category. Rituals do not correspond to our ideas of scientific rationality or efficacy, and in general, they cannot be incorporated into a modern healthcare system. And if you tried to incorporate them into the system as a health bureaucrat, you would be abrogating your duty. And finally, a similar point for systematization or regulation. If you were to incorporate them, then you have to count them, you have to make sure they're safe, you have to license them, you have to categorize them. And if, as a public health worker or a health bureaucrat, if you don't do that, you're not doing your duty. That's your job, is to make sure that they're safe, to make sure that they can be fit in, to categorize them, and so on and so forth. An official health regime requires the systematization of practices so that they can be monitored, controlled, and improved, if for no reason than reasons of size, as Vikram said this morning. You can't have these kind of idealistic solutions. You're talking about the most efficient system for the widest number of people.